13. 100 Essential Citations from Leading Scientists. The following 100 quotes from leading scholars in various scientific fields highlight the surprising and thought-provoking nature of these discoveries. They are essential because they uncover the metaphysical significance of the insights these discoveries provide about reality and existence. Furthermore, they illustrate how weak and even discredited the old materialist frameworks of thought are in comparison. Nietzsche's claim that God is dead, held by the scientists of the 19th and 20th centuries, has itself suffered a mortal wound. In the science today, God is more alive than ever. 1. Cosmology, physics, chemistry. An asterisk indicates that the citation has been previously referenced. 1. Alexander Vilenkin, 1949 to the present. Professor of Theoretical Physics at Tufts University and Director of the Tufts Institute of Cosmology, on his theorem demonstrating the necessity of an absolute beginning to the universe. It is said that an argument is what convinces reasonable men, and a proof is what it takes to convince even an unreasonable man. With a proof now in place, cosmologists can no longer hide behind the possibility of a past eternal universe. There is no escape. They have to face the problem of a cosmic beginning. 2. Roger Penrose, 1931 to the present. Professor of Mathematics at Oxford and winner of the 2020 Nobel Prize in Physics. But in order to start off the universe in a state of low entropy, so that there will indeed be a second law of thermodynamics, the Creator must aim for a much tinier volume of the phase space. Several pages of argumentative calculations follow. This now tells us how precise the Creator's aim must have been, namely to an accuracy of 1 part in 10 to the power of 10 to the 123rd. This is an extraordinary figure. Even if we were to write a 0 on each separate proton and on each separate neutron in the entire universe, and we could throw in all the other particles as well for good measure, we should fall far short of writing down the figure needed. 3. Richard Feynman, 1918 to 1988, physicist, pioneer of quantum mechanics, and 1965 Nobel laureate in physics. There is a most profound and beautiful question associated with the observed coupling constant, E, the amplitude for a real electron to emit or absorb a real photon. It is a simple number that has been experimentally determined to be close to 0.08542455. It has been a mystery ever since it was discovered more than 50 years ago, and all good theoretical physicists put this number up on their wall and worry about it. It's one of the greatest damn mysteries of physics, a magic number that comes to us with no understanding by man. You might say the hand of God wrote that number, and we don't know how he pushed his pencil. 4. Christian Anfinsen, 1916 to 1995. Professor of Chemistry at Harvard and winner of the 1972 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. I think only an idiot can be an atheist. We must admit that there exists an incomprehensible power or force with limitless foresight and knowledge that started the whole universe going in the first place. 5. Alfred Kastler, 1902 to 1984, winner of the 1966 Nobel Prize in Physics and the inventor of the laser. The idea that the world, the material universe, created itself seems to me patently absurd. I do not conceive of the world without a creator, which is to say, without a God. For a physicist, a single atom is so complicated, so pregnant with intelligence, that the materialist universe simply makes no sense. Again, there is no chance of explaining the emergence of life and its evolution by the interaction of chance forces. Other forces are at work. 6. Werner Heisenberg, 1901 to 1976, who invented quantum mechanics and won the 1932 Nobel Prize in Physics. Atomic physics has turned science away from the materialistic trend it had during the 19th century. 7. Robert Laughlin, 1950 to the present. Professor of Physics at Stanford and winner of the 1998 Nobel Prize in Physics. The theories of everything in general and string theory in particular left me more and more perplexed all the time because they are unfalsifiable. No experiential data can prove that they are wrong. I realized that people accept string theory for ideological reasons. It was a terrible shock to me because I thought that scientists shunned any form of ideology. That's far from the case. 8. Robert W. Wilson, 1936 to the present. The radio astronomer who discovered cosmic microwave background radiation and won the 1978 Nobel Prize in Physics. Certainly there was something that set it all off. Certainly, if you are religious, I can't think of a better theory of the origin of the universe to match with Genesis. 9. William D. Phillips, 1948 to the present. Specialist in the laser cooling of atoms and 1997 Nobel laureate in physics. Why is the universe so finely tuned for the existence of life? More to the point, why is the universe so finely tuned for the existence of us? Does this constitute legitimate scientific evidence for an intelligent creator? It may, but it is not universally compelling. 10. Robert Millikan, 1868 to 1953. The physicist who calculated the charge of the electron and the Planck constant, winner of the 1923 Nobel Prize in Physics. A lifetime of scientific research has convinced me that there is a divinity who is shaping the destiny of man. 11. George Thomson, 1892 to 1975. British physicist, Nobel co-laureate in 1937. Probably every physicist would believe in a creation of the universe if the Bible had not unfortunately said something about it many years ago and made it seem old-fashioned. 12. Arthur Schawlow, 1921 to 1999, professor at Stanford, co-inventor of the laser, and 1981 Nobel laureate in physics. The world is just so wonderful that I can't imagine it just having come by pure chance. 13. Robert Jastrow, 1925 to 2008, astrophysicist, professor at Columbia, and director of NASA. For the scientist who has lived by his faith in the power of reason, the story ends like a bad dream. He has scaled the mountains of ignorance. He is about to conquer the highest peak. As he pulls himself over the final rock, he is greeted by a band of theologians who have been sitting there for centuries. 14. Paul Davies, 1946 to the present. Cosmologist and astrobiologist, professor of theoretical physics at the University of Adelaide and formerly at Cambridge. The multiverse theory seems to have become the main explanation for scientists to justify the remarkable ability of our universe to welcome life. But this theory is problematic for me. The death of scientism, of its determinism, of its dream of a transparent science that can access the secret of the universe, was a kind of torture for the Nobel Prize laureates who lived the quantum adventure. 15. Anthony Hewish, 1924 to 2021. Professor of astronomy at Cambridge and winner of the 1974 Nobel Prize in Physics for the discovery of pulsars. I believe in God. It makes no sense to me to assume that the universe and our existence is just a cosmic accident, that life emerged due to random physical processes in an environment which simply happened to have the right properties. God certainly seems to be a rational creator. That the entire terrestrial world is made from electrons, protons, and neutrons, and that a vacuum is filled with virtual particles demands incredible rationality. 16. Arno A. Penzias, 1933 to 2024, Nobel Prize in Physics, 1978. In order to achieve consistency with our observations, we must assume not only creation of matter and energy out of nothing, but creation of space and time as well. The best data we have are exactly what I would have predicted had I nothing to go on but the 5 books of Moses, the Psalms, the Bible as a whole. The Big Bang is a moment of discrete creation from nothing. 17. Richard Smalley, 1943 to 2005. Professor of Chemistry at Rice University and 1996 Nobel laureate in chemistry. Although I suspect I will never fully understand, I now think the answer is very simple. It's true. God did create the universe about 13.7 billion years ago, and of necessity has involved himself with his creation ever since. The purpose of this universe is something that only God knows for sure, but it is increasingly clear to modern science that the universe was exquisitely fine-tuned to enable human life. 18. Charles Townes, 1915 to 2015, physicist, professor at Berkeley, winner of the 1964 Nobel Prize in Physics, and former director of NASA. I strongly believe in the existence of God based on intuition, observations, logic, and also scientific knowledge. Again, many cosmologists have a feeling that somehow intelligence must have been involved in the laws of the universe. Also, determinism no longer holds water. Biologists have not yet learned the limits of their knowledge, though it is staring them in the face. 19. Marc Olivier, 1953 to the present. Physicist, pupil of Prigogine. Let's assume, along with Stephen Hawking and Steven Weinberg, that the development of our universe since the Big Bang is the result of pure chance alone. This universe, guided totally by chance, managed to synthesize a self-replicating RNA molecule. The probability that this synthesis took place according to the laws of chance can be calculated. It is thus also possible to calculate the time it would take for a chance-based universe to do it. It turns out that this time is millions of times greater than the age of our present universe. Thus, the chance hypothesis is refuted in its own language, the calculation of probabilities. 20. George Smoot, 1945 to the present. Astrophysicist and cosmologist, professor at Berkeley, Nobel laureate 2006. The most cataclysmic event that we could imagine, the Big Bang, appears when closely examined to be precisely orchestrated. On the detailed images provided by the WMAP satellite, he said, "If you're religious, it's like looking at God. The order is so beautiful and the symmetry so beautiful that you think there is some design behind it." Then, in 2006, when he received the Nobel Prize for his striking images of the first light of the universe, "It is like seeing God. I saw the universe at its very beginning. I saw the anisotropy that allowed the universe to exist." 21. Donald Page, 1948 to the present. Professor of Physics and Cosmology at the University of Alberta. In view of all the evidence, including both the elegance of the laws of physics, the existence of orderly sentient experiences, and the historical evidence, I do believe that God exists and think the world is actually simpler if it contains God than it would have been without God. 22. Jin Soon Tuan, 1948 to the present. Buddhist astronomer, professor of astrophysics at the University of Virginia, and research associate at the Institut d'Astrophysique de Paris. One of the most surprising discoveries of modern cosmology is the realization that the initial conditions and physical constants of the universe had to be adjusted with exquisite precision if they are to allow the emergence of conscious observers. This realization is referred to as the anthropic principle. Change the initial conditions and physical constants ever so slightly, and the universe would be empty and sterile. We would not be around to discuss it. The precision of this fine-tuning is nothing short of stunning. The initial rate of expansion of the universe, to take just one example, had to have been tweaked to a precision comparable to that of an archer trying to land an arrow in a 1 square centimeter target located on the fringes of the universe 15 billion light-years away. Again, I reject the hypothesis of chance because, aside from the meaninglessness and despair it would entail, I cannot conceive that the harmony, symmetry, unity, and beauty we perceive not only in the world, from the delicate pattern of a flower to the majestic architecture of galaxies, but also in the laws of nature are the mere results of chance. If we accept the hypothesis of a single universe, our own, we must also postulate a primary cause that from the outset tweaked the laws of physics and initial conditions in order for the universe to become conscious of itself. If we accepted the hypothesis of a single universe, our own, we must also postulate a primary cause. 23. Edward Harrison, 1919 to 2007. Professor of Astrophysics at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. Here is the cosmological proof of the existence of God, the design argument of Paley, updated and refurbished. The fine-tuning of the universe provides prima facie evidence of deistic design. Take your choice: blind chance that requires multitudes of universes, or design that requires only one. Many scientists, when they admit their views, incline toward the teleological or design argument. 24. Robert Dicke, 1916 to 1997, professor of physics at Princeton, discoverer of the fine-tuning of the universe. The puzzle here is the following: how did the initial explosion become started with such precision? The outward radial motion becomes so finely adjusted as to enable the various parts of the universe to fly apart while continuously slowing in the rate of expansion. There seems to be no fundamental theoretical reason for such a fine balance. If the fireball had expanded only 0.1% faster, the present rate of expansion would have been 3 times 10 to the third as great. Had the initial expansion rate been 0.1% less, and the universe would have expanded to only 3 times 10 to the minus sixth of its present radius before collapsing, no stars could have formed in such a universe, for it would not have existed long enough to form stars. 25. Lee Smolin, 1955 to the present, materialist physicist. We must understand how it came to be that the parameters that govern the elementary particles and their interactions are tuned and balanced in such a way that a universe of such variety and complexity arises. We should ask just how probable is it that a universe created by randomly choosing the parameters will contain stars? The answer, in round numbers, comes to about 1 chance in 10 to the 229th. Again, the universe is improbable, and it is improbable in the sense that it has a structure which is much more complex than it would be if its laws and initial conditions were chosen more randomly. 26. Gregory Benford, 1941 to the present. Professor of Physics and Astronomy at the University of California, Irvine. This multiverse view represents the failure of our grand agenda and seems to me contrary to the prescribed simplicity of Occam's razor, solving our lack of understanding by multiplying unseen entities into infinity. 27. Brian Greene, 1963 to the present. Professor of Physics and Mathematics at Columbia, expert in string theory. The laws of physics are the closest thing in the world today that I would align with a theological perspective. I view the world as extraordinarily coherent and harmonious because of the way the fundamental laws of physics are able, with just a few symbols etched on a piece of paper, to describe a wealth of phenomena, from subatomic particles to the edge of the universe. That resonates with me in a similar way as the order, organization, and explanation for the universe that adherents of religion will ascribe to a deity. From my perspective, that order and organization come from fundamental physical laws. For others, that's the role that God plays. 28. Henry F. Schaefer, 1944 to the present, professor of chemistry, director of the Center for Computational Chemistry at the University of Georgia, and one of the most quoted chemists in the world. Against powerful logic, some atheists continue to claim, irrespective of the anthropic constraints, that the universe and human life were created by chance. 29. Werner Gitt, 1937 to the present, professor and director of the Federal Institute of Physics and Technology, Brunswick. All experiences indicate that a thinking being voluntarily exercising his own free will, cognition, and creativity is required. There is no known law of nature, no known process, and no known sequence of events which can cause information to originate by itself in matter. 30. Carlo Rubbia, 1934 to the present, professor of physics at Harvard, director of CERN, expert in particle physics, 1984 Nobel laureate. Speaking of the origin of the world brings us inevitably to think of creation, and, in considering nature, we find that it has an order too precise to have been determined by chance from confrontations between forces that we, physicists, continue to maintain. However, I believe that the existence of a pre-established order of things is more evident among us than elsewhere. We come to God by the path of reason. Others follow the irrational path. 31. Derek Barton, 1918 to 1998. Professor of Chemistry at Imperial College and at Harvard, 1969 Nobel Laureate in Chemistry. The observations and experiments of science are so wonderful that the truth that they establish can surely be accepted as another manifestation of God. God shows himself by allowing man to establish truth. 32. Jacques Desmarais, 1943 to 1999. Cosmologist specializing in the anthropic principle and professor at the University of Liège. The mere fact that we are present here in the universe tells us something about the value of the fundamental constants, for example, the physical constants such as the Planck constant or the fine structure constant. Though scientists do not know why these constants have the specific values they do, what we are certain about is that if they varied even slightly, then life could never have emerged. 33. John Polkinghorne, 1930 to 2021. Professor of Mathematics and Physics at the University of Cambridge. The precise adjustment of the initial conditions of the universe is an indispensable element of the existence of the world. Through their discoveries, scientists encounter the divine Logos. 34. Isidore Isaac Rabi, 1898 to 1988, winner of the 1944 Nobel Prize in Physics. Physics filled me with awe, put me in touch with a sense of original causes. Physics brought me closer to God. That feeling stayed with me throughout my years in science. 35. Herbert Uhlig, 1907 to 1993, physical chemist and professor of metallurgy at MIT. The origin of the universe can be described scientifically as a miracle. 36. Shoichi Yoshikawa, 1935 to 2010, professor of astrophysics at Princeton. I think that God originated the universe and life. Homo sapiens was created by God using a process which does not violate any of the physical laws of the universe in any significant way. 37. Antonino Zucchichi, 1929 to the present, physicist at CERN, president of the European Physical Society and of the World Federation of Scientists. Without science, we would have no retort for an atheistic culture that wishes we were nothing more than sons of chance. 38. Freeman Dyson, 1923 to 2020, physicist, astrophysicist, futurologist, and professor at Princeton. As we look out into the universe and identify the many accidents of physics and astronomy that have worked together to our benefit, it almost seems as if the universe must in some sense have known that we were coming. 39. Max Born, 1882 to 1970, physicist and professor of theoretical physics at Göttingen, Nobel Prize in Physics, 1954. If alpha, the fine structure constant, were bigger than it really is, we should not be able to distinguish matter from ether, the vacuum, nothingness, and our task to disentangle the natural laws would be hopelessly difficult. The fact, however, that alpha has just its value, 1/137th, is certainly no chance, but itself a law of nature. It is clear that the explanation of this number must be the central problem of natural philosophy. 40. John Barrow, 1952 to 2020, professor of astronomy at Cambridge, speaking about theories of the universe emerging from nothing. These theories necessarily assume the existence of far more than what we would usually consider nothing. From the beginning, there must be laws of nature, energy, mass, geometry, and, implicitly, the world of mathematics and of logic. There must be a considerable underlying structure based on rationality. One must remain aware of the fact that many studies on cosmology are motivated by the desire to avoid an initial singularity. 41. Arthur Compton, 1892 to 1962, professor of physics at Princeton and winner of the 1927 Nobel Prize in Physics. If religion is to be acceptable to science, it is important to examine the hypothesis of an intelligence working in nature. The discussion of the evidences for an intelligent God is as old as philosophy itself. The argument on the basis of design, though trite, has never been adequately refuted. On the contrary, As we learn more about our world, the probability of its having resulted by chance processes becomes more and more remote, so that few indeed are the scientific men of today who will defend an atheistic attitude. 42. George Efstathiou, 1955 to the present. Professor of Cosmology, Director of the Institute of Astronomy at Cambridge, and member of the scientific team of the European Space Agency's Planck satellite. Even if the probability of developing a universe is very low with a weak cosmological constant, if there were an infinity of universes, it would have appeared somewhere. But is this really an explanation or a desperate answer? 43. Max Planck, 1858 to 1947. One of the founders of quantum mechanics, 1918 Nobel laureate in physics and discoverer of the quantum structure of radiation. Metaphysical reality does not stand spatially behind what is given in experience but lies fully within it. Again, anybody who has been seriously engaged in scientific work of any kind realizes that over the entrance to the gates of the Temple of Science are written the words, "You must have faith. It is a quality which the scientists cannot dispense with." Also, all matter originates and exists only by virtue of a force. We must assume behind this force the existence of a conscious and intelligent spirit. 44. Tony Rothman, 1953 to the present. Cosmologist and professor of physics at Wesleyan University. When confronted with the order and beauty of the universe and the strange coincidences of nature, it is very tempting to take the leap of faith from science into religion. I am sure many physicists want to. I only wish they would admit it. 45. Max Tegmark, 1967 to the present, astronomer at MIT. The multiple parallel universes allow us to ignore the fine-tuning of the cosmos's initial conditions and of the fundamental constants. At the end of the day, we are making our judgment based on nothing more than what we find most exquisitely to our taste. 46. Dr. Alan Sandage, 1926 to 2010. One of the most celebrated astronomers of our day, who recognized his belief in God at the age of 50. The world is too complicated in all parts and interconnections to be due to chance alone. 47. Lothar Schaefer, 1939 to 2020, professor of quantum chemistry at the University of Arkansas. At the root of all ordinary objects, we find entities that possess the rudiments of consciousness. In quantum leaps, quantum systems act spontaneously. A spirit is the only thing we know of that can act that way. One cannot use science as a basis for atheism. It's a lost cause. 48. Fred Hoyle, 1915 to 2001. Cosmologist and astronomer. The chance that higher life forms might have emerged in this way is comparable with the chance that a tornado sweeping through a junkyard might assemble a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe calculate the probability of the 2,000 enzyme proteins needed to accelerate the chemical reactions needed to cause life at one chance in 10 to the 40,000th, calling this an outrageously small probability that could not be faced even if the whole universe consisted of organic soup. I've always thought it curious that, while most scientists claim to eschew religion, it actually dominates their thoughts more than it does the clergy. Again, I do not believe that any scientist who examined the evidence would fail to draw the inference that the laws of nuclear physics have been deliberately designed with regard to the consequences they produce inside the stars. 49. Robert Caïta, 1952 to the present. Professor of Physics and Astrophysics at Princeton. Science is impossible without accepting that we live in a caused universe that ultimately should encourage one to acknowledge its first cause or creator. 50. Wernher von Braun, 1912 to 1977, former director at NASA and inventor of the V-2 rocket, the first ballistic missile used during World War II. One cannot be exposed to the law and order of the universe without concluding that there must be design and purpose behind it all. The better we understand the intricacies of the universe and all it harbors, the more reason we have found to marvel at the inherent design upon which it is based. To be forced to believe only one conclusion, that everything in the universe happened by chance, would violate the very objectivity of science itself. Certainly there are those who argue that the universe evolved out of a random process, but what random process could produce the brain of a man or the system of the human eye? 51. Henry Lipson, 1910 to 1991, President of the Physics Department at the University of Manchester. I think we must admit that the only acceptable explanation is creation. I know that this is anathema to physicists, as indeed it is to me, but we must not reject a theory that we do not like if the experimental evidence supports it. 52. John O'Keefe, 1916 to 2000, NASA astronomer, planetary scientist, and a major leader in developing the American lunar science program during the early Project Apollo era. If the universe had not been made with the most exacting precision, we could never have come into existence. It is my view that these circumstances indicate the universe was created for man to live in. 53. Vincent Fleury, 1963 to the present, biophysicist, researcher at CNRS, and teacher at the École Polytechnique. What is consonant with physics as we currently understand it is either a God who fixed everything at the beginning, or one who intervenes in the reduction of a quantum wave packet. Everything else is physically impossible unless God does not respect the laws of physics. 54. Walter Kahn, 1923 to 2016, physics professor at the University of California and winner of the 1998 Nobel Prize in Chemistry. There continue to be very deep epistemological questions about the significance of sharp scientific laws like the laws of quantum mechanics and the laws that govern the nature of chaos. Both of these fields have irreversibly shaken the 18th and 19th centuries' purely deterministic, mechanistic view of the world. 55. Pierre Perrier, 1935 to the present, mathematician, logician, and physicist. The argument that it was all simply a matter of time and that there was a sufficient amount of it after the earth had formed flies in the face of numerical reality. The proponents of this or that metaphysics must take into account the combinatorial explosion that results from all possible configurations, while also respecting the chronologies and duration of formation of the real world that surrounds us, which forms the backdrop against which we may launch attempts to falsify the available theories. 56. Bernard d'Espagnat, 1921 to 2015, professor of physics at the University of Paris. Quantum mechanics has delivered us from the lead cloak of deterministic materialism. Again, Bohr has unmade what Copernicus had made. He has put man back at the center of his own representation of the universe. 57. Stephen Hawking, 1942 to 2018, professor of mathematics at Cambridge, who, despite the following words, was an atheist all the same. If the rate of expansion 1 second after the Big Bang had been smaller by even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before it ever reached its present size. Again, the laws of science contain many fundamental numbers. The remarkable fact is that the values of these numbers seem to have been very finely adjusted to make possible the development of life. Again, what is it that breathes fire into the equations and makes a universe for them to describe? Finally, the odds against a universe like ours emerging out of something like the Big Bang are enormous. I think clearly there are religious implications whenever you start to discuss the origins of the universe, but I think that most scientists prefer to shy away from the religious side of it. 58. Sir James Hopwood Jeans, 1877 to 1946. British physicist, astronomer, and mathematician. The stream of knowledge is heading towards a non-mechanical reality. The universe begins to look more like a great thought than like a great machine. Mind no longer appears as an accidental intruder into the realm of matter. 59. Joe Rosen, 1937 to the present. Professor of physics at Tel Aviv University and the University of Central Arkansas. The anthropic principle is among the most important fundamental principles around, even, let me dare venture, the most basic principle we have. 60. Nicolas Gizon, 1952 to the present. Professor of physics at the University of Geneva and specialist in quantum mechanics. Non-local correlations seem in some way to emerge from outside space-time. Who keeps track of who is entangled with whom? That is, where is the information stored? Are there angels manipulating enormously huge Hilbert spaces? Let us emphasize that we take such questions very seriously. 61. David Gross, 1941 to the present, professor of theoretical physics at the University of California, 2004 Nobel laureate. The danger of the anthropic principle is that it is impossible to disprove. 62. Jeffrey Chu, 1924 to 2019, professor of theoretical physics at Berkeley. Appeal to God may be needed to answer the origin of the universe question. 63. Hubert Reeves, 1932 to 2023, popular astronomer and professor of astrophysics at the University of Paris and the University of Montreal. The laws governing physical forces possess remarkable properties. They seem to us to be fine-tuned to promote complexity. Tiny variations of the numerical values that specify them would be enough to render the universe sterile. No life form, no complex structure would ever have arisen from it, not even an atom of carbon. 2. Biology and Life Sciences. 64. Sir Francis Crick, 1916 to 2004, co-discoverer of DNA in 1953, winner of the 1962 Nobel Prize in Medicine. At present, the gap from the primal soup to the first RNA system capable of natural selection looks forbiddingly wide. An honest man, armed with all the knowledge available to us now, could only state that in some sense the origin of life appears at the moment to be almost a miracle, so many are the conditions which would have had to have been satisfied to get it going. Again, we can't help but notice the intrinsic beauty of the DNA double helix. It is the molecule which has style. 65. George Wald, 1906 to 1977, professor of sensory physiology at Harvard, Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1967. And now for my main thesis. If any one of a considerable number of the physical properties of our universe were otherwise, some of them basic, others seemingly trivial, almost accidental, that life, which seems now to be so prevalent, would become impossible here or anywhere. Again, when it comes to the origin of life, there are only two possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on philosophical grounds, therefore we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. 66. Richard C. Lewontin, 1929 to 2021, Harvard evolutionary biologist. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, in spite of its failure to fulfill many of its extravagant promises of health and life, in spite of the tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just-so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism. Moreover, that materialism is absolute, for we cannot allow a divine foot in the door. 67. Ilya Prigogine, 1917 to 2003, Nobel Prize in Chemistry in 1977, and Isabel Stengers, philosopher, epistemologist, born in 1949. In biology, the opposition between anti-reductionists and reductionists has often taken the form of a rivalry between fraternal enemies, proponents of internal finality versus those advocating for external finality. The idea of an immanent organizing intelligence is thus countered by a model of organization borrowed from the technology of the era, mechanical, thermal, or cybernetic machines, which immediately raises this objection: who assembled the machine? Is this automaton governed by an external purpose? 68. Christian Duduve, 1917 to 2013, biochemist, winner of the 1974 Nobel Prize in Physiology. God plays dice because he is sure to win. I opted for a meaningful universe, not a meaningless one. Not because I wanted it to be that way, but because that's how I interpret the scientific data we have. The universe was pregnant with life and the biosphere with man. 69. John Eccles, 1903 to 1997, neurologist, electrophysiologist, winner of the 1963 Nobel Prize in Medicine. I maintain that the human mystery is incredibly demeaned by scientific reductionism, with its claim in promissory materialism to account eventually for all of the spiritual world in terms of patterns of neuronal activity. This belief must be classed as a superstition. Again, I am constrained to attribute the uniqueness of the self or soul to a supernatural spiritual creation. 70. Werner Arber, 1929 to the present. Microbiologist and winner of the 1978 Nobel Prize in Medicine. Life only starts at the level of a functional cell. The most primitive cells may require at least several hundred different specific biological macromolecules. How such already quite complex structures may have come together remains a mystery to me. The possibility of the existence of a creator, of God, represents to me a satisfactory solution to this problem. 71. Jacques Monod, 1910 to 1976, atheist, biologist and biochemist from the Pasteur Institute in Paris, Nobel Prize in Physiology or Medicine in 1965. The machinery by which the cell, at least the non-primitive cell, which is the only one we know, translates the code consists of at least 50 macromolecular components which are themselves coded in the DNA. Thus, the code cannot be translated except by using certain products of its translation. This constitutes a baffling circle, a really vicious circle, it seems, for any attempt to form a model or theory of the genesis of the genetic code. 72. Ernst Chain, 1906 to 1979, professor at the universities of Berlin, Cambridge, and Oxford, pioneer in the development of penicillin, and 1945 Nobel laureate in physiology or medicine. I would rather believe in fairies than in such wild speculation. I have said for years that speculations about the origin of life lead to no useful purpose, as even the simplest living system is far too complex to be understood in terms of the extremely primitive chemistry scientists have used in their attempts to explain the unexplainable that happened billions of years ago. God cannot be explained away by such naive thoughts. 73. Simon Conway Morris, 1951 to the present, professor of paleontology at Cambridge. The evolutionary routes are many, but the destinations are limited. In essence, this approach posits the existence of something analogous to attractors by which evolutionary trajectories are channeled towards stable nodes of functionality. The nodes of occupation are effectively predetermined from the Big Bang. If the universe is actually the product of a rational mind and evolution is simply the search engine that in leading to sentience and consciousness allows us to discover the fundamental architecture of the universe, then things not only start to make much better sense, but they are also much more interesting. Farewell bleak nihilism, the cold assurances that all is meaningless. We are indeed dealing with unfinished business. God's funeral? I don't think so. 74. Sarah Woodson, 1967 to the present, professor of biophysics at Johns Hopkins University, speaking about the nanomachines, such as the flagellar motor, in various types of cells. The cell's macromolecular machines contain dozens or even hundreds of components, but unlike man-made machines, which are built on assembly lines, these cellular machines assemble spontaneously from their protein and nucleic acid components. It is as though cars could be manufactured by merely tumbling their parts onto the factory floor. 75. George Church, 1954 to the present, atheist, professor of genetics at Harvard and MIT, and director of the Center for Computational Genetics. The ribosome is the most complicated thing that is present in all organisms. If I were to be an intelligent design defender, that's what I would focus on. How did the ribosome come to be? But isn't it the case that, if we take all the life forms we have so far, isn't the minimum for the ribosome about 53 proteins and 3 polynucleotides? That's really marvelous. Nobody has constructed a ribosome that works well without proteins. 76. Wilder Penfield, 1891 to 1976. Renowned neurologist specializing in the recall of memories through stimulation of the brain, professor at McGill University. After a professional lifetime spent in trying to discover how the brain accounts for mind, it comes as a surprise now to discover, during this final examination of the evidence, that the dualist hypothesis, body and soul, seems the more reasonable of the two possible explanations. 77. Ernst Mayr, 1904 to 2005, professor at Harvard and one of the most prominent and vocal defenders of neo-Darwinism. The problem of the origin of life poses a keen challenge. The chances that this improbable phenomenon could have occurred several times is exceedingly small, no matter how many millions of planets in the universe. 78. Michael Denton, 1943 to the present, former director of Prince of Wales Hospital's Genomics Lab, Sydney, Australia, professor of biochemistry at the University of Otago, New Zealand. In short, the laws of physics are supremely fit for life, and the cosmos gives every appearance of having been specifically and optimally tailored to that end. There is simply no tolerance possible in the design of the celestial machine. For us to be here, it must be precisely as it is. The new picture that has emerged in 20th century astronomy presents a dramatic challenge to the presumption which has been prevalent within scientific circles during most of the past 4 centuries, that life is a peripheral and purely contingent phenomenon in the cosmic scheme. These advances in astronomy and physics have established what for Newton and generations of natural theologians was only an affirmation of belief, that there is indeed a deep and necessary connection between virtually every characteristic of the cosmic stage and the drama of life. 79. Daniel Cohen, 1951 to the present, professor of genetics at the University of Avery and scientific director of GenSet, a genetic engineering lab, helped map the human genome. The genome is a program written in a very sophisticated language. Could such a complex language arise by accident? We are free to suppose that, but we can't demonstrate it. Personally, I went from being an atheist to agnostic in the space of 1 year, because if this language is not the result of chance, then I suspect that one day we will be able to demonstrate it. Imagine what a sea change that would be. 80. Michael Behe, 1952 to the present, professor of biochemistry at Lehigh University. The simplicity which one believed to be the foundation of life has been revealed to be a fantasy which has been replaced by systems of frightening complexity. The awareness that life was conceived by an intelligent being is a shock for we men of the 20th century who were made to think that life was the result of simple natural laws. 81. Dean H. Kenyon, 1939 to the present, professor emeritus of biology at San Francisco State University. It is absolutely incredible to observe on this microscopic scale such a finely tuned mechanism, a device that bears the mark of intelligent design and manufacturing. We have the details of a highly complex molecular universe which manages genetic information, and it is precisely in this new branch of molecular genetics that we see evidence of the most indisputable intelligent design on Earth. 82. Pierre-Jules Lejeune, 1932 to 2007, winner of the 1991 Nobel Prize in Physics. Another thing that intrigues me is the fact that the genetic code is always the same, whereas life has adopted many different solutions. I have difficulty believing that Darwinian evolution could give rise to only a single type of code. 83. Hubert P. Yockey, 1916 to 2016. Professor of Theoretical Physics at Berkeley and specialist in information theory applied to biology and the origins of life. The origin of life by chance in a primeval soup is impossible in probability in the same way that a perpetual motion machine is impossible in probability. The extremely small probabilities calculated in this chapter are not discouraging to true believers. A practical person must conclude that life didn't happen by chance. 84. Georges Salé, 1907 to 2002, polytechnician, statistician, author of Hasard et Certitude, which opposes the invincibility of chance as theorized by Jacques Monod. It is not those who think that living beings arose through the action of an intelligent being who make appeal to miracles, but those who deny it. 85. Roger Sperry, 1913 to 1994, neurologist and winner of the 1981 Nobel Prize in Medicine. I must take issue especially with the whole general materialistic reductionist conception of human nature and mind that seems to emerge from the currently prevailing objective analytic approach in the brain behavior sciences. I suspect that we have been taken, that science has sold society and itself a somewhat questionable bill of goods. 86. Philippe Labro, 1971 to the present, researcher at the Center for Molecular Biophysics, CNRS, Orléans. For some researchers, the fact that the living cell shows a terrifying level of complexity proves that it probably could not have come about in stages, but rather that it emerged fully formed out of nothing. The probability of such an event happening is comparable to the chances of a tornado blowing over a dump heap to create a functioning Airbus A320 out of scrap metal. 87. Yves Coppin, 1934 to 2022. Paleontologist and paleoanthropologist. It is still astonishing that changes for the better happen just when they are needed. In any case, chance does things better than can be believed. 88. Ali Demirsoy, 1945 to the present. Professor of Biological Sciences at Hacettepe University in Ankara. The probability of the formation of a cytochrome C sequence, an enzyme necessary for life, is as likely as 0. That is, if life requires a certain sequence, it can be said that this has a probability likely to be realized once in the whole universe. In fact, the probability of the formation of a protein and a nucleic acid, DNA-RNA, is a probability way beyond estimate. Furthermore, the chance of the emergence of a certain protein chain is so slight as to be called astronomic. 89. Pierre-Paul Grosset, 1895 to 1985. Professor of Biology at the University of Paris, zoologist and ethologist. The idea that man is the result of innumerable errors in the copying of DNA during molecular duplication seems, upon reflection, absurd, not a damning fault in itself, but also contrary to reality, which condemns the idea. 90. John Joe McFadden, 1956 to the present, Professor of Molecular Genetics at the University of Surrey. But who's doing the tweaking? Another reason scientists are wary of the anthropic principle is that it seems to reverse the Copernican revolution and place humankind at the center of the universe. Even worse, it could allow creationists to bring the G word back into science. 91. Stuart Kauffman, 1939 to the present. Professor of Biophysics at the University of Vermont and specialist in complex systems. Consider all proteins of length 200 amino acids. There are 20 to the 200th power or 10 to the 260th power such proteins. Were the 10 to the 80th particles in the universe to do nothing but make proteins length 200 on the Planck timescale, it would require 10 to the 39th times the lifetime of the universe to make all these proteins just once. 92. Perry Reeves, 1945 to the present, Professor of Chemistry at Abilene Christian University. When one examines the vast number of possible structures that could result from a simple random combination of amino acids in an evaporating primordial pond, it is mind-boggling to believe that life could have originated in this way. It is more plausible that a great builder with a master plan would be required for such a task. 93. Francis Collins, 1950 to the present, geneticist, director of the American National Institute of Health, and specialist in the sequencing of the human genome. Belief in God can be an entirely rational choice, and the principles of faith are, in fact, complementary with the principles of science. 94. Bruce Lipton, 1944 to the present, professor at the University of Wisconsin. As a conventional biologist, I believed that I was merely a mechanism and that my life was nothing but the folds of molecules. And so I felt that I was only an accident, as Darwin had said. My research in cellular biology showed me that I was far more than my physical reality, and that there was an energy, a spirit, or a God that controlled the laws of biology. 3. Mathematics. 95. Kurt Gödel, 1906 to 1978, logician and professor of mathematics at Princeton. Mechanism in biology is a prejudice of our time which will be disproved. In this case, one disproof, in my opinion, will consist in a mathematical theorem to the effect that the formation within geological time of a human body by the laws of physics, or any other laws of similar nature, starting from a random distribution of the elementary particles in the field, is as unlikely as the separation by chance of the atmosphere into its components. There is a scientific, exact philosophy and theology, this is also more highly fruitful for science, which deals with the concepts of the highest abstractness. Est Deus. God exists. 96. Paul Dirac, 1902 to 1984. One of the fathers of quantum mechanics and winner of the 1933 Nobel Prize in Physics. God is a mathematician of a very high order, and he used very advanced mathematics in constructing the universe. 97. Alexander Polyakov, 1945 to the present, mathematician, professor at Princeton. We know that nature is described by the best of all possible mathematics because God created it. 4. Philosophy of Science. 98. Antony Flew, 1923 to 2010, professor of philosophy at the University of Reading and one of the greatest atheist philosophers of our time. He chose atheism at age 15 and wrote against divine creation for more than 54 years. The title of his article, Theology and Falsification, is the most explicit. He publicly renounced this stance in 2004 and later said, with regret, "As people have certainly been influenced by me, I want to try and correct the enormous damage I may have done." Again, the most impressive arguments for God's existence are those that are supported by recent scientific discoveries. The argument to intelligent design is enormously stronger than it was when I first met it. Also, what I think the DNA material has done is that it has shown, by the almost unbelievable complexity of the arrangements which are needed to produce life, that intelligence must have been involved in getting these extraordinarily diverse elements to work together. When you examine RNA as a chemist, you simply experience such complete awe before a molecule that is so wondrous, as well as before its magnificent complexity, that you ask yourself the question, how is it possible that this structure appeared? 99. Edward Feser, 1968 to the present, American atheist turned Catholic philosopher, professor of philosophy at Pasadena City College in Pasadena, California. I don't know exactly when everything clicked. There was no single event, but a gradual transformation. As I taught and thought about the arguments for God's existence, and in particular the cosmological argument, I went from thinking, these arguments are no good, to thinking, these arguments are a little better than they are given credit for, and then to, these arguments are actually kind of interesting. Eventually it hit me. Oh my goodness, these arguments are right after all. By the summer of 2001, I would find myself trying to argue my wife's skeptical physicist brother-in-law into philosophical theism. 100. Neil Manson, professor of philosophy at the University of Mississippi. The multiverse hypothesis is alleged to be the last resort for the desperate atheist. 14. What do scientists believe in? The previous chapter explored the challenges and surprises that some of the greatest scientists of the 20th century faced as they grappled with the implications of their own discoveries. This leads us to the related question of belief among scientists in general. Conventional wisdom holds that modern scientists are not very religious, or at least far less religious than the general population. Some people consider this a sign that science leads naturally to unbelief, an indirect proof that God does not exist. To address this common perception, this chapter will study belief among scientists in depth, analyzing a selection of surveys and studies on the question. The first thing to note is that the claim is made up of two distinct underlying questions that we will consider separately. 1. Do materialist scientists today outnumber the scientists who believe in something? Do they represent an overwhelming majority? 2. If unbelieving scientists are indeed an overwhelming majority, is this a consequence of their scientific knowledge or of other factors? 1. Let us begin by examining the major studies on religious belief among scientists. 1. A 2009 study by the Pew Research Center, Scientists and Belief, has the largest sample size and is the most recent of studies on the issue. It shows that a majority of American scientists, 51%, believe in something, while a minority, 41%, are atheists. 7% of scientists polled declined to answer the question. If we compare these results with rates of belief among the general population, it is undeniable that a greater proportion believe in something. Believers made up 95% of those surveyed. It is worth noting that younger scientists, those under the age of 34, are much more likely to claim some kind of belief, 66%, than older researchers. In fact, only 46% of researchers over 65 claimed some form of belief. This study is so valuable because it is recent, 2009, and takes into account researchers working in every scientific field. Additionally, the survey was carried out in the United States, the undeniable world leader in scientific research and a place where scientists are particularly numerous. In contrast to other studies, the survey offered a wide selection of possible responses, including, for example, belief in a creative spiritual being that is not a personal God. The survey provided space for respondents to express their doubts and even allowed them to skip questions they did not wish to answer. 2. A 2003 study by geneticist Baruch Abba Shalev analyzed the beliefs of all Nobel laureates since the prize's inception. Entitled 100 Years of Nobel Prizes, the study showed that 90% of Nobel Prize winners identified with some religion, and that 2/3 of them have been Christians. Further, 35% of the recipients of the Nobel Prize in Literature have been atheists, as compared with only 10% among scientists. Incidentally, this goes to show that, at least according to this survey, there are more atheists in the field of literature than in the sciences. Between 1901 and 2000, the 654 Nobel laureates belonged to 28 different religions. A majority of them, 65.4%, identified as Christian. More precisely, Christians won 72.5% of the prizes awarded in chemistry, 65.3% in physics, 62% in medicine, and 54% in economics. Jews were awarded 17.3% of the prizes in chemistry, 26.2% in medicine, and 25.9% of the prizes in physics. Atheists, agnostics, and freethinkers were awarded 7.1% of the prizes in chemistry, 8.9% in medicine, and 4.7% in physics. Muslims have won 13 prizes in total, or 2% of the total prizes awarded, including 3 in the scientific categories. This second survey is of interest because while its scope is very broad in terms of time and space, it concerns only Nobel Prize recipients. Since Nobel laureates represent the world's scientific elite, their opinions and beliefs carry more weight than those of the general population. As the Nobel Prize was created in 1901, the study spans the entire 20th century. The questionable aspect of this survey is the uncritical identification made between culture and belief, which in no way guarantees that the belief is actually embraced by the individual concerned. 3. In a 1989 survey of heads of research units in the exact sciences at the French National Center for Scientific Research, 110 of the researchers surveyed described themselves as believers, 106 as unbelievers, and 23 as agnostic. 70% believed that science can neither prove nor disprove the existence of God. The percentage of believers in this study is similar to the 2009 study cited above, around 50%. 4. James H. Luba's studies. 2 studies undertaken in 1914 and 1933 by the American psychologist James H. Luba showed disbelief increasing over time among people identified as what the study terms greater scientists, while the percentage had remained stable among scientists in general since 1914, around 60.7%. What were his criteria for making this judgment? There is no answer. These first 4 studies show relatively homogeneous results. We will now consider 2 others that draw a diametrically different conclusion, that believers make up a very small percentage of scholars. 5. A 1998 Nature study entitled Leading Scientists Still Reject God reported that among the American scientists of the National Academy of Scientists, only 7% described themselves as believers, 20% as agnostics, and all the rest as atheists. What the study does not tell us is that this academy was founded in 1867 in the context of a bitter polemic between science and religion. Since its foundation, all members have been hand-picked for their commitment to the Academy's particular ideals. The percentage of its scholars who are believers is so markedly different from that found in the other studies that it is obviously unrepresentative. Even the title of the study, Leading Scientists Still Reject God, displays a marked bias that reinforces our doubt about the survey's objectivity. 6. A survey of 1,074 members of the British Royal Society carried out by E. Cornwell and M. Sturrett by email in 2007 presents a similar case. 86% of respondents categorically denied believing in a personal God, while only 3% said they believed. As with the previous survey, this study has the major defect of being confined to one academy whose limited number of members has always been self-selecting. The resulting figures are a statistical anomaly, making this study as questionable as the last and deserving of similar skepticism. As we see it, the results of the last two studies are compromised by bad sampling. Their sample sizes are limited and unrepresentative, since the scholars surveyed belong to academies with a self-selecting closed membership. The conclusion that emerges from the first four surveys, whose sample size is in fact large enough to be statistically significant, is that the proportion of scientists who believe in something remains high. According to the first study, believers even constitute a majority in the United States, the world's leading producer of scientific research. Therefore, the claim that scientists who believe are now only a small minority is completely unfounded and inaccurate. 2. Let us now examine the fact that the proportion of believers among scientists is smaller than the proportion of believers among the general population, and let's see what factors might cause this difference. What are we to make of the fact that the percentage of scientists who are believers is lower than that of believers in the general population? What factors might be at the root of this difference? If we go by the results of the Pew Research Center's poll, the most recent and broadest survey of the scientific community, we find that, as in most studies of this type, the number of respondents who believe in something is lower among American scientists, 51%, than among the rest of the U.S. population, 95%. This difference could be chalked up to several causes, including science itself, the socioeconomic class of scientists, the historic conflicts between science and religion, the very recent nature of the discoveries supporting the existence of a creator God, the thermal death of the universe, the Big Bang, fine-tuning, the improbability of life arising by chance, etc. 1. The influence of socioeconomic status on belief. A recent survey from the Pew Research Center was categorical. Wherever you are in the world, the richer you are, the less religious you are. This phenomenon, already mentioned in the introduction to this book, should come as no surprise. Material comfort, the security of social systems, and medical progress have made turning to any god to solve mankind's problems seem unnecessary. If we look at the Pew Research Center study in detail, the correlation between standard of living and disbelief is extremely well established. Since scientists tend to be well off, it might be expected that they are less religious than others. The correlation between belief and standard of living is firmly established, but there has not yet been any empirical evidence establishing a correlation between belief and scientific education. It is therefore impossible to claim at this stage that science makes people less religious. If scientists are indeed less religious than the rest of the population, it is possible that this is simply attributable to their high standard of living. 2. Correlation is not causation. Hasty correlations often lead to false conclusions. The question of correlation is a complex one. Here we are dealing with a well-established and clear correlation between a low-status, high-belief group and a high-status, low-belief group, and scientists belong to the latter. It is therefore unsurprising that, due to this factor alone, scientists tend to be less religious than the average person. If we aren't satisfied with that answer, what would it take to prove a causal relation between advanced scientific knowledge and lack of belief in God? We would start by determining more precisely how the standard of living parameter functions as a factor in disbelief. This would require a similar survey of individuals in a variety of professional sectors who enjoy a comparable standard of living, but have no special scientific knowledge. We could study professors, lawyers, writers, and actors, for example. If it turned out that the people of this category, enjoying a social status and high standard of living comparable to leading scientists but without their advanced scientific knowledge, believed in God at a higher rate, then we could conclude that there is indeed a causal link between greater scientific knowledge and a decreased belief in God. Inversely, if individuals of socially equivalent status but lacking advanced scientific training turn out to have similar rates of unbelief to those of scientists, then science can be eliminated as a factor influencing unbelief. Unfortunately, to our knowledge, none of these surveys have been conducted, nor is it at all certain that they would be conclusive. What would happen if it turned out that professors, philosophers, actors, and writers were just as unbelieving as scientists? The popular myth of causality between science and disbelief would definitively fall apart. We are not claiming that there is no causal link between science and belief, as we do not have the data to prove this. What we do claim is that based on the evidence available today, it is impossible to draw a conclusion from this correlation. The limited data available to us does tend to make us doubt it. As noted above, Nobel Prize-winning scientists are much more likely to be believers than the winners of the top prize in literature. 3. Long-standing conflicts between science and religion. Although most of the great scientific discoveries of the modern era were made by Christian scientists, scientists who remained Christian even after they made their discoveries, like Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, and Kepler, their findings, perhaps inevitably, sparked lively controversy. But these controversies were often instrumentalized by Christianity's detractors. As a result, the history of modern science is usually told as a battle between scientists struggling to spread their discoveries and religious people attempting to maintain their own interests and worldview. Perhaps influenced by this version of scientific history, many scientists of our time have rejected religion in general, and by extension the very idea of the existence of God. It is obviously impossible to put a precise figure on the impact of this distorted historical narrative, but it is important to keep in mind nonetheless. 4. Many scientific discoveries favoring the existence of God are very recent. New and convincing scientific proofs for the existence of a creator God have only emerged very recently, most of them only within the last generation. The thermal death of the universe was not definitively proved until 1998. The necessity of a beginning to the universe, Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem, dates only to 2003. The discovery of the fine-tuning of the universe dates only from the 1980s. The complexity of DNA and the intricacy of the smallest living cells, coupled with the improbability of life arising through pure chance, was discovered only in the early 1960s. The controversies generated by these modern discoveries resemble the uproar provoked by Galileo and Darwin in their own times and are probably just as inevitable. How long did it take for Darwin's discoveries to be accepted? Perhaps 100 or 150 years? No doubt this new proof for the existence of God will also take time to produce its effect. According to a Pew study included in the bonus PDF, the percentage of younger American scientists who believe in something, 66%, is strikingly higher than the percentage of scientists over 65, only 46%, who do. The survey may illustrate the early stages of a shift in opinion among scientists. 5. Another thing to consider when drawing a causal relationship between belief and scientific knowledge. Baruch Abba Shalev's study revealed that Nobel laureates in science are more religious than Nobel laureates in literature. The fact is of utmost importance because Nobel Prize winners are held to be remarkable regardless of the field in which they excel. We can therefore learn from this that, among remarkable individuals, science is more of a factor in belief than disbelief. Conclusion. The first assumption noted at the beginning of this chapter, that there are not many believers among scientists today, is at best unfounded and probably inaccurate. The second assumption is equally baseless. There is no verifiable evidence to support the claim that scientists are less religious because of their scientific knowledge. It is likely that we need to look at other factors, such as their socioeconomic status or the fraught history of science itself, to explain this tendency. 2 more surveys of scientists on the question of religious belief. In a 2002 report analyzing 43 studies conducted since 1927, Mensa, an association of gifted people with an IQ over 132, some 2% of the population, concludes, the higher one's intelligence or education level, the less one is likely to be religious or hold beliefs of any kind. Once again, we encounter a logical fallacy. A correlation is observed and wrongly presented as causation without any justification. A study published by CIRST, Centre interuniversitaire de recherche sur la science et la technologie, based in Montreal, Canada, and carried out by 2 sociologists, Christophe Tallien, research fellow at CNRS, and Yves Gingras, professor of history at the University of Quebec in Montreal, concludes, the more religious one is, the less competent in science. The 2 authors carried out a comparative analysis of religious practice, belief, and level of scientific advancement with samples taken internationally. For them, the results seem clear. The more people identify with and practice a religion, the weaker their scientific skills are. As a general rule, more religion translates into less science. This CIRST study commits the same error as did the previous one. It confounds correlation and causation. How can we account for the significant differences between the conclusions of these various studies? How is it possible that in dealing with a question as apparently simple as, does science make people believe less in God, we find studies with results at opposite ends of the spectrum? On one hand, we find 51% of U.S. scholars believing in something, according to the Pew Research Center study, and 90% of the Nobel Prize-winning scientists self-identified as believers in Barak Abba-Shalev's dubious study. With only 3% of scholars reported as believers in Cornwell and Sturrott's study, we get the impression that on this topic it is possible to read everything and its opposite. These divergent results likely stem from the sensitive nature of the subject itself. The problem of the existence of God, which underlies the relationship between science and belief, is difficult to approach dispassionately. This translates into the choice of methods, whether conscious or not, that skew the poll's results according to the presuppositions of the surveyors. As we have already seen, multiple parameters are subject to bias here. Poorly worded questions, correlation hastily interpreted as causation, non-representative or even clearly biased samples, statistics based on averages between groups that are too different. As we come to the end of these 2 chapters devoted to the opinions of scientists in general on this matter, a question springs naturally to mind. What were the beliefs of the scientists who played a major role in the great scientific advances of the 20th century? 2 such cases prove particularly interesting, that of Einstein, without question the greatest physicist of the last century, and Gödel, whom John von Neumann called the greatest mathematician and logician since Aristotle. As we shall see in the 2 chapters to follow, these 2 men were no strangers to the question of God. What's more, their reflections on the question of the existence of God appear to have been directly linked to their scientific work, and this has been the case for many other scholars in recent decades. Several great atheist or agnostic scientists became deists purely on the basis of 20th century scientific discoveries. In The Return of the God Hypothesis, Stephen Meyer gives a few examples, including Fred Hoyle, who is convinced by the discovery of the astonishing adjustments needed for the genesis of carbon in the stars, see page 164, and famous Caltech astronomer Alan Sandage, page 31, as well as his colleague Owen Gingerich, page 31. But also physicist George Greenstein, page 176, and biologist Dean Kenyon, page 204.